When people are introduced to sumo for the first time, they see two very large men run into each other, then keep pushing and pulling until one of them falls down. If this interests them and they keep watching, eventually they want to know which large man is the best at making the other large men fall down. That's when they're told about the Banzuke, sumo's ranking system. If you're very new to sumo and want to learn the Banzuke basics, such as what the divisions are, the ranks in the top division, the titles, and the broad strokes of how wrestlers move up and down the Banzuke, I strongly recommend watching Sumo Stew's video on the subject. There will be a link in the description. It's very well made and contains all the information you need. This video is for everyone trying to figure out how the Banzuke actually functions. Why do wrestlers move as much or as little as they do? What process turns the chaotic mess of names and ranks and records into art? In short, how does the Banzuke actually work? For this video, we'll look at the Natsu Basho from May of 2022 and how the ranks and records there were used to set the Banzuke for the Nagoya Basho in July. This is a good example Banzuke because the way everyone is ranked is pretty easy to understand, with only a handful of judgment calls required. In a follow-up video, I'll go through the creation of a different Banzuke, one that was much more chaotic and messy, to show how hard the process can sometimes be, but that it still results in something mostly logical. One thing that gets people confused about the Banzuke is that there are technically no set rules regarding how wrestlers are moved on it. A committee decides after each basho where to rank all the competitors for the next one, and what they say goes. But there are some standards and guidelines in place we can use to understand, if not 100% of the decisions this committee makes, at least the vast majority of them. I'll introduce these as we go along. So, without further ado, let's begin. Here we have the two main divisions in sumo: Makuuchi, the top division, on the left, and Juryo, the second division, on the right. The colors and arrows represent the basic understanding new sumo fans have of how the rankings work. Wrestlers with winning records, the ones in blue, will go up in rank, and those with losing records, in red, will go down. Of course, more goes into it than just that. The same guidelines apply to the vast majority of the names you see here. However, the wrestlers at the top, the Yokozuna and Ozeki, move according to different rules. Those are pretty easy to deal with, so let's knock those out before moving on to everyone else. Rule number 1. Reorder the Yokozuna and Ozeki according to their records in the previous basho. If there's only one Rikishi, a wrestler, at one of these ranks, he maintains the top position regardless of record. For example, Terunofuji at the time of recording. So if we look at the top division, here we see their records. Terunofuji is the only Yokozuna, but we have 3 Ozeki that are going to need to be shuffled around. So let's push everyone off to the sides and move them where they need to go. Terunofuji, Yokozuna East. Easy. Takakeisho had the best record of the current Ozeki, so he goes to Ozeki 1 East. Mitakeumi, even though he only had 6 wins, still had more than Shodai, so he goes second into Ozeki 1 West, and then Shodai, last, goes to Ozeki 2 West. Rule number 2. If anyone is newly promoted to one of these ranks, they stay behind anyone who was previously there, regardless of record in the previous basho. So, going back to this example, there's been talk about Wakataka Kage maybe making Ozeki. He only had 9 wins in the previous basho, which is, still pretty good, but if he had had 12, he probably would have become an Ozeki. Had that happened, Shodai would be pushed across to Ozeki 2 East, and Wakataka Kage would end up at Ozeki 2 West. But that didn't happen, so this is now what we have. And then rule number 3. Balance the Yokozuna and Ozeki ranks as a whole between East and West. So at the time of recording, we have 1 Yokozuna and 3 Ozeki, so we put the 3rd Ozeki at Ozeki 2 West rather than Ozeki 2 East, so there's 2 East and 2 West wrestlers in those upper ranks. So as you can see, if we were like this, everything would be very unbalanced, but like this, it's 2 and 2, nice and clean, and we can move on. Let's get into the rules that govern everybody else. This is a shorthand list. I'll timestamp this, there will be lots of timestamps in the comments. If you just need a quick reminder of what the rules are, you can come here and read this, but I will get into these in more detail. So the short list. 1. Make initial movements by subtracting losses from wins and moving wrestlers that many ranks. 2. Don't do them dirty. Don't under or over demote wrestlers, and promote them as much as necessary to make the Banzuke work. 3. In the promotion or demotion ranges of the divisions, so bottom of Makuuchi, top of Juryo, prioritize wrestlers who had been in the higher division during the last basho. Once these guidelines are followed, and even while following them, especially that last one, the committee's judgment determines the final result. A good committee will be consistent with how they handle certain situations, but the committee members can change, and if they do, that can change how the Banzuke start turning out. So if you watch the sport for a long time, keep that in mind. Okay, let's get into the first two rules in a little more detail. First, the win-loss or odd number rule. To calculate a wrestler's quote-unquote correct position on the Banzuke, subtract their losses from their wins. If a wrestler goes 9 and 6, they go up 3 ranks because 9 minus 6 is 3. If they finish 6 and 9, they go down 3 ranks because 6 minus 9 is negative 3. If they miss any bouts, those count as losses. So you see I'm using 2, 4, and 9 as an example because that's what you're going to see next to Onisho's name on the Natsu Banzuke that we're using as an example. For him, it's the same as going 2 and 13. 2 minus 13 is negative 11. He'll go down 11 ranks to start. You can also think of this as the odd number rule if you really hate arithmetic, because the answers that you get are always going to be odd. 8 minus 7 is 1, 9 minus 6 is 3, 10 minus 5 is 5, and so on and so forth. You can think of it as 8 wins is 1, 9 wins, that's the next odd number, so that's 3, 10 wins, that's the next odd number, that's 5, and it works going down the line too for guys with losing records. If it's easier for you to do that, that's fine. It works out exactly the same way. Important point. This is done to create a starting point for the committee to work from, not to determine exactly where everyone should end up. It sets where the wrestlers should be relative to each other, so if a group of them has to move to fill in gaps, the committee knows what general order to keep them in. Alright, let's move on to the second rule, which is a pair of rules in and of itself. The don't do 'em dirty rules. These are a couple of guidelines which are generally followed to ensure wrestlers are moved fairly on the Banzuke. Number 1, do not over-demote losing wrestlers. The corollary is to not under-demote them either, because that would be unfair to everyone else. Find an acceptable demotion range and keep them in that range if at all possible. Number 2, promote winning wrestlers as much as is necessary to keep losing wrestlers within an acceptable demotion range. It's better to promote an 8 and 7 wrestler 6 ranks, as happened with Aoyama from January to March of this very year, 2022, than to treat a losing record improperly. So if we're going to do that, we need to know what's an acceptable demotion range. Well, it looks like this. If you look at these numbers, the first thing you should notice is that the fewer wins a wrestler has, the wider the range becomes. I haven't read a specific reason for this. My guess is that if someone has, say, 2 wins in a basho, dropping 7 ranks instead of 11 isn't nearly as bad, but it still hurts quite a bit. Thus, this is a range the committee can use and still feel like the wrestler has absorbed an appropriately punishing loss of rank. The plus or minus 1 is because circumstances do push wrestlers outside of these ranges, but it's uncommon. You can even find examples where wrestlers are demoted 2 ranks less or more than the range listed here, but it's quite rare and requires very specific situations. In short, if you find anyone demoted outside of these ranges, chances are that circumstances simply aligned in an unusual way and the committee had nowhere else to put them. Now, one other thing you might notice about these ranges, if you're quick with arithmetic, is that the bottom of the ranges equal what you get if you put the wins minus the losses. 7 minus 8, negative 1, 1 rank. 6 minus 9, negative 3, 3 ranks, and so on. This tends to be the absolute maximum that the committee will drop a wrestler. So if you like to play Guess the Banzuke, predict how a Banzuke is going to turn out, once you do the math for the guys who are getting demoted, you can usually treat where you're putting them as a floor and not move them any lower unless you absolutely have no choice. Alright, that's enough talking about the rules. Let's go to the Banzuke and put these ideas to work. For now, we're going to deal with Sekiwake and Komusubi only. There's not a lot of room for people to go up at the top when they have winning records, so let's see how this plays out. Wakatake Kage is Sekiwake East. Sekiwake East is the highest rank possible for someone who hasn't reached the standards for Ozeki promotion. It's possible, though rare, for someone at Sekiwake East to have a winning record, but for Sekiwake West to do so well that they flip spots. As you can see, Abi has 7 wins, so that's not going to happen. Wakatake Kage can't go up because he's not being promoted. He can't go down because he has a winning record, so he's just going to stay at Sekiwake East. Abi has 7 wins. Sekiwake with 7 wins will fall to Komusubi. There's no rule that requires that, but there hasn't been a Sekiwake with 7 wins that dropped to Maegashira in 30 years. It would require an incredibly weird set of circumstances for that to happen, so we can expect Abi will go to Komusubi. Daisho and Hoshoryu are both Komusubi, both have winning records, and both could theoretically go to Sekiwake. We will use the win-loss rule to put Daisho in the vacant slot. Hoshoryu is a half rank ahead, East versus West, but Daisho's 11 wins give him effectively 7 ranks of promotion power, whereas Hoshoryu's 8 wins only give him 1. Although this sort of runs into the don't do him dirty rule, where Hoshoryu is a guy with a winning record and theoretically could get a promotion, this is an instance where there just isn't anywhere for him to go. Daisho has earned the Sekiwake slot over him, so he's going to get it. However, since Hoshoryu has a winning record, he won't be demoted, so he stays at Komusubi East, Abi goes to Komusubi West, we're all set here, and we can move on. I do want to say that this Banzuke is kind of unusual in that we can sort out the whole Sanyaku first, because frequently there's a Komusubi with a losing record or a Sekiwake with 6 or fewer wins that will drop back to Maegashira, so the Maegashira wrestlers become part of figuring out who's going to be in Sanyaku. But it is helpful to look at these ranks first and figure out if there are any moves that absolutely must happen, so things don't get confused once the Maegashira ranks come into play. Now we start shuffling the other wrestlers around following the win-loss rule. Keep them on the same side of the Banzuke for now. We'll have to adjust later, which is when some of these are moved from one side to the other. Now, when I'm doing this on a spreadsheet, I usually do these all at once, but since we have limited space and I want to make this an easier learning experience, we're only going to do the first chunk. In this case, the first chunk is going to be down to Maegashira 6. Ura, 9 wins, going to go up to Maegashira 3. Wakamoto Haru, same thing, Maegashira 3. Everyone below them has a losing record, so they're going to go down. That makes for a good cutoff point. So if we do the calculations for the top 6, we end up with this. Some guys have moved pretty far down. We're not going to worry about them for now. You might also look at this and say, okay, you moved 12 wrestlers, 7 are on the Banzuke, and 5 are floating off into space. What's going on? Well, the blue ones at the top, I had to put them to the outside because we have people in those ranks already, but that's just to maintain their order in terms of relative promotional power. Kirabayama is ahead of Takanosho. They're on the same level, but Kirabayama is East versus West. Both of them are ahead of Kotonowaka. Kotonowaka is ahead of Tamawashi. And as it turns out, luckily, we have 4 Maegashira slots open. So let's move them all down into those slots and see what we get. So that looks pretty clean. Except we still have the problem of what do we do with Ichinoko? Remember when I said that if somebody misses fights, those count as losses? Ichinoko is an exception. There is a term called kyujo, which refers to when a guy misses fights and they all count against him, they're all counted as losses. But there is another term called kosho. That refers to wrestlers who are unable to fight, but their rank is protected. Ichinoko was out because of COVID, and COVID absent wrestlers are determined to be kosho. Their ranks are protected. Okay, so what do we do about him? He was Maegashira 1 West. Shouldn't we just put him back in the same place? Well, it's not necessarily that simple. See how Kotonowaka is at Maegashira 2 East? Remember when we started, he was at Maegashira 2 West? Well, if we put Ichinoko at Maegashira 1 West, we end up with Kotonowaka at Maegashira 2 West again. Takanosho has earned his place in front of Kotonowaka, so he has to move down as well, and Kotonowaka gets pushed back. The problem here is that it breaks the don't do him dirty rule. An 8 and 7 wrestler could be kept in the same slot, and it's okay. It's not preferable, but it's okay. But Kotonowaka was 9 and 6. He really has to be given a promotion unless there's literally nowhere for him to go. As it turns out, being kosho doesn't mean you're guaranteed the same rank. It just means you are rank protected so that you don't absorb the full consequences of being out. Ichinoko can be dropped in rank. It's happened before to some Juryo wrestlers, and it can happen now. So the fairest way to do it is instead to put Ichinoko at Maegashira 2 West. Then you have Takanosho at 1 West, Kotonowaka getting some kind of a promotion at 2 East. It's only half a rank, but it's something. And Tamawashi, who is also 9 and 6, goes from Maegashira 3 West to 3 East. Another tiny promotion, but it's still a promotion. Ura, Wakamoto Haru, and Takayasu all get bumped back to make way, and we're good to go. A quick note for anyone who saw that and said, wait a minute, didn't you move Takayasu out of his demotion range? The research I did into demotion ranges was based on the numbers, not really East and West. So he went from Maegashira 1 to Maegashira 4, that's still 3 ranks, so it fits. If there was a situation that would push him to Maegashira 5, but instead the other guys could absorb less of a promotion and he could be kept at Maegashira 4, I think there's a good chance they would do that. But he's still at 4, everything worked out, we can leave it be. Alright, we've got the top 4 ranks done. Endo is actually safe also at Maegashira 5 East, nobody's going to catch up to him, so we're going to do the next batch. As you can see, Sado no Umi was 11 and 4 at Maegashira 12 West, so he's going to jump pretty far. But below him, everybody was 8 and 7, 1 9 and 6 guy, a bunch of guys with losing records, so we're going to go down to Maegashira 12 as our next batch. And when we calculate those out, we end up with this. Now, we still don't have any overlapping wrestlers, but we do have a hole to fill at Maegashira 7 West. When I was doing my Banzuke prediction, I just moved everyone straight up and left it at that. Hokuto Fuji went to 7 West, Tochinoshin went to 8 East, and so on. But it worked out slightly differently. It ended up looking like this. Now you see the asterisks by Nishikigi and Shimano Umi? Well, if we go back a step, we can see Nishikigi actually jumped a full rank and Shimano Umi didn't move at all. I thought Shimano Umi would go up to Maegashira 8 West, and he didn't. Well, how come? This is something that is up to the judgment of the committee, and it really could go either way. What it appears that they did was they took Shimano Umi, who was 7 and 8 at Maegashira 8 East, and left him at 9 East because that's exactly 1 rank demotion, the quote-unquote range for a 7 and 8 record. Nishikigi, since he had a winning record, bumping him a little bit ahead of Shimano Umi was really not a big deal, so you leave Shimano Umi in the appropriate place, give the guy with the winning record a little bit more of a bump, and everybody's happy. Well, except Shimano Umi, I guess. And now from here, we can fill out the rest of the Banzuke. Here we have the rest of the Banzuke set up. There are 4 guys at the bottom off the Banzuke, they're going to be demoted. You can see Ishiura is 0015 like Ichinoko was. Ishiura was out due to an injury, not due to COVID, so he wasn't protected. He's going to absorb 15 losses worth of demotion. But before we get to them and any demotion stuff, let's fill in the gaps we have on the Banzuke here. The first ones are Maegashira 10 and 11, and obviously the first 3 guys that are set up to go there are Chiyo Tairyu, Kodoshoho, and Meisei. The obvious thing to do is to put Chiyo Tairyu and Kodoshoho at Maegashira 10 in whatever order, and Meisei at Maegashira 11 East. But Kodoshoho was at Maegashira 9 East, and he went 6 and 9. The range for a 6 and 9 record is a demotion of 2 to 3 ranks. So Kodoshoho really shouldn't go any higher than Maegashira 11 East. If there was no one else to take those spots at 10, he could go higher, but we have people. We have Chiyo Tairyu and Meisei. So it's perfectly easy to push them both up to Maegashira 10, put Kodoshoho at Maegashira 11 East, and we wind up with this. Cake. With that sorted, the next question is, what do we do with Terutsuyoshi and Midori Fuji? They landed on the same rank, but Midori Fuji has a better record. Some Banzuke committees would prefer the guy who had the higher rank to start with. But we could see that Nishikigi got the advantage over Shimano Umi, even though he was behind, because that made Shimano Umi take a quote-unquote appropriate demotion. Terutsuyoshi is 5 and 10, or was 5 and 10, so he should have a 3 to 5 rank demotion. For Maegashira 8 West, that means 11 West would be at the absolute minimum end of that range. If this Banzuke committee is trying to make sure guys get appropriate demotions, minimum might not cut it. Midori Fuji being at 11 West and Terutsuyoshi going to 12 East would make sure that he gets at least a little bigger of a demotion, and the guy with the winning record is prioritized a bit. And in fact, that is exactly what happened. Hopefully this is what we see from here on out for the rest of the Banzuke. That's the kind of consistency you're looking for. Lo and behold, right away, we have another example of a winning record versus a losing record, and we can see what the committee does here. Given what we've seen so far, it seems almost safe to assume that Ichi Yamamoto is going to end up ahead of Chiyo Shoma. And really, maybe we can ask the question, is he going to end up ahead of Takara Fuji? Well, no. He did end up ahead of Chiyo Shoma, so they were consistent in that respect. And leaving him behind Takara Fuji really was not an inconsistency, because remember, Takara Fuji was 4 and 11, so he had a very wide demotion range. He was Maegashira 7 East, we dropped him to Maegashira 14 East for calculation purposes, now he's at 12 West. That's still 5.5 ranks, it's pretty significant. He's not being underpunished by setting things up this way. Ichi Yamamoto went from 15 West to 13 East with an 8 and 7 record. That's still pretty good. Everything is working out pretty fairly. As you can see, at this point, we have 4 slots left to fill in Makuuchi. We also have 4 guys getting demoted, so maybe now we need to look at the Juryo division. Now, here you can see we've put the bottom of Makuuchi with the guys who are being demoted there, so we can do all these calculations together. And once we move everybody into their appropriate spot, this is what we get. If you can count relatively quickly, you've probably noticed that there were 4 slots in Makuuchi, but 6 Juryo wrestlers who've qualified for a promotion. What do we do? Well, it's not actually that difficult. If there's more Juryo wrestlers who qualify for a promotion than there are slots, the ones at the bottom of the promotion list don't get promotions. In this case, Hideno Umi and Ryuden are just left out in the cold. Our Makuuchi setup with the newly promoted Juryo wrestlers now looks like this. And this would be the time for us to revisit the cross-divisional rule. The rule for cross-divisional movement is that if wrestlers end up mathematically on the same rank, but one was in a higher division during the previous basho, that wrestler is generally favored in the rankings. The direction of the movement is irrelevant. It doesn't matter if it's Juryo wrestlers going up to Makuuchi or Makuuchi wrestlers going down to Juryo. The Makuuchi wrestler will have the advantage if they end up on the same spot. Furthermore, if the wrestler who was in the lower division ends up slightly ahead of the wrestler who was in the higher division during these initial calculations, some committees will still favor the wrestler who was previously in the higher division. How much of an advantage is up to each committee. Some of them have relatively significant advantages for the guys who were in the higher division before. Some of them don't seem to offer any advantage. That part, it really changes as the people on the committee change. But when the wrestlers are tied in the calculations, usually the one who had been in the higher division before gets the advantage. Final note, this does not apply if the wrestler from the higher division cannot be placed any higher because of demotion rules. Fairly self-explanatory, but it bears mentioning. So what does it actually look like when that rule is put into play? Let's look at this setup. Onosho and Dayamami are on the same level, but Onosho was in Makuuchi. Let's put him in front. Oho, Chiyomaru, same thing. We'll keep Oho in front. But otherwise, let's put all of these guys further up in the order that they're in right now. This is what you get. Now, if you saw my Guess the Banzuke video for Nagoya 2022, this was the setup that I had. And it ended up being very, very wrong. Myogiryu was a half rank behind Tsurugisho. It was not simply this committee doing a weird thing that put him in front. I ended up going back and researching more and more Banzukes. This is not what they always do, but this is not that uncommon. When the guy from the higher division is at least close, they give him the advantage. So they put Myogiryu in front. Not every committee would do that. These ones did. Onasho, he goes where he goes. What I said about Ura and Wakamoto Haru being kept kind of as a pair since they were at the same rank and they had the same record, Oho and Yutakiyama were treated that way, Dayamami and Nishiki Fuji were treated that way. Even if you assume that was going to happen though, some committees, they would have left Chiyomaru last, but they would have put Dayamami and Nishiki Fuji at 15 West and 16 East, and Oho and Yutakiyama lower down. That's not how this committee felt about it. If you like to predict Banzukes, you're just going to have to read their minds. This one's very much a judgment call. It can change very much depending on the people involved in the decision. It is what it is. Now that we have Makuuchi sorted out, let's go to Juryo. As you can see, I moved Hidenoumi and Ryuden to Juryo 1 East to show that they have priority over everyone else in the division. Now, it would be simple enough to take those first 4 guys, those 2 Tohakuryu and Daishoho, and fill them into the first 2 Juryo ranks. But remember, Azumaryu and Kageyaki were demoted, and as we've already seen, guys from Makuuchi can be given an advantage over the ones who were in Juryo. So let's take these first 10 guys all the way down to Tokushoryu and figure out where they're going to fit in. Azumaryu and Kageyaki are the ones from Makuuchi. They're both pretty close to Daishoho, so they should end up ahead of him. But Azumaryu is a rank and a half behind Tohakuryu, Kageyaki's 2 ranks behind Tohakuryu, so let's assume for the moment that they're going to stay behind him. If we do that, we end up with this setup. Hidenoumi, Ryuden, Tohakuryu, Azumaryu, Kageyaki, and then everybody else. This is what we actually got. 3 things I want to point out here. 1. If we go 1 step back, we see Mitoryu was 7 and 8, Chionokuni was 6 and 9, and 1 more step back, they were on the same rank. So the guy with the better record is still being preferred in those cases, even though they both had losing records. Okay, cool, consistency. Azumaryu still got the advantage over Tohakuryu despite being a rank and a half behind. So we see that this committee will give a substantial advantage to guys from Makuuchi versus guys from Juryo when they end up in the same division in the following basho. That's a big advantage, but it is what it is. That's what they decided. This is what we should probably expect. But Ryuden and Hidenoumi is the one thing that really doesn't make any sense at all. The only thing that explains this is sumo politics. And if you are going to try to predict Banzukes, understand Banzukes after they come out, you shouldn't need to know sumo politics. But here's the fact. Ryuden, he was demoted pretty far because he broke COVID restrictions, and so a lot of people are mad at him. But Hidenoumi was caught up in a gambling scandal. Eventually all charges were dropped, so I don't even know how guilty he was of anything. But he's got a real black mark on his record in the eyes of a lot of people. Hidenoumi was 8 and 7, there was a spot for him at Juryo 1 East, he should have been moved up. Ryuden should have gone from Juryo 3 West to Juryo 1 West. That's still a pretty good promotion. He's still in perfect position to get to Makuuchi. For them to do this, genuinely, I think what they want is for Hidenoumi to go 8 and 7 again, and then they have room to once more not promote him to Makuuchi. If he was 8 and 7 at Juryo 1 East, they wouldn't have much of a choice. There's no other explanation for this. There's no logic to this decision. Occasionally, you're gonna get these. It sucks, but it's one of the downsides to sumo sometimes. We see it, we deal with it, we move on. From here out, the Banzuke is pretty straightforward. Bushozan and Atami Fuji are on the same level. Atami Fuji has a better record, and the committee has pretty consistently preferred the wrestler with a better record in these circumstances. So, Atami Fuji goes ahead. Kodokuzan is 2 ranks behind Aqua. Now remember, Azumaryu was placed ahead of Tohakuryu from a rank and a half behind. Kageyaki was not from 2 ranks behind. So it looks like Aqua is going to stay ahead of Kodokuzan and move to 7 East, and Kodokuzan will go ahead of everyone else into 7 West. Hiradoumi, Kaisho, and Enho look like they might be placed in that order, but remember, Kaisho was at Juryo 9 East with a losing record. He cannot go higher than that. That makes this pretty easy. Hiradoumi goes to 8 East, Enho to 8 West, and Kaisho, fortunately for him, doesn't absorb any demotion at all and just stays at 9 East. Similarly, Shimizu-umi cannot go past 10 East because that's where he was in the last basho, and he had a 7 and 8 record. So Churano-umi is the only option to go to Juryo 9 West. And now we have our last demoted Makuuchi wrestler, Ishiura. With 0 wins, he has the largest demotion range, and historically, committees will go quite far to protect guys that had 0 wins, especially due to injury, if the opportunity arises. In this instance, he's a rank and a half behind Kaisei and Tochimaru, which this committee has been giving the Makuuchi wrestlers the advantage in that circumstance anyway, so he is almost certainly going to go to Juryo 10 West. Then, between Kaisei and Tochimaru, you would expect Tochimaru to go to 11 East and Kaisei to 11 West, because that's how they've been doing things all the way through. And yet, sure, Ishiura got his 10 West slot, but for some reason, Kaisei was given the advantage over Tochimaru in a situation where the wrestler with the winning record has been given the advantage every other time in the creation of this Banzuke. This may be another situation of sumo politics, or maybe not politics, but just kind of good feeling towards an old-time wrestler. Kaisei's been dealing with an ankle injury. They may be trying to give him every last chance to keep it together and maintain his salary, because he is almost certainly going to retire if he drops out of Division 2. It's hard to say. I don't know what they're thinking. They rarely talk about these things. I don't know if they ever talk about these things. But that's the only reason I can figure why they would break their consistency in this instance. And to finish things off, we move Kitanowaka and Yago up a couple of steps because there's plenty of room for them. And then 4 Makushita wrestlers are promoted to Juryo, and we just delete the other 4 out of existence as though they were never there. And that's going to do it for this part of Learn the Banzuke. As you can see, we have the final Banzuke for both the Makuuchi and Juryo divisions going into Nagoya 2022. I'm glad we had such a recent example to use as a relatively easy way to explain how the system works, and I hope you've gotten answers to some, if not all, of your questions about how the Banzuke functions. If you want to know anything I haven't covered, leave a comment and I'll respond as soon as I'm able. And remember, there will be a part 2 where I show the creation of the Hatsu 2020 Banzuke based on the Kyushu 2019 Basho. There isn't much more in the way of lessons on how the Banzuke works in it, but it is absolute chaos and shows how bonkers the whole process can become. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed the video and have a great day.